All right. Three, two,
Oh God.
one. And welcome to episode one of, I need to quickly remember the name of the podcast, Anonymous Portrait. A quick break from your weekly re-educated episode. I am so excited to present these conversations to you. And today we have an extremely special guest named Stranger Numero Uno. How are you doing today?
I'm great. I'm great.
See, no one will ever know who this is unless they like really developed a complex machine learning algorithm and then put your voice through it and then took every video on the internet and then found the perfect match and then they would know who you are. Are you ready for that risk?
I'm ready for the risk.
Have you signed all your rights away?
Consider it signed. Here we go. Stranger number one. Stranger number one.
Who could it be? Like honestly, there's no way to figure it out. But I'm actually very, very excited to have this conversation. And so I guess, I was telling you this earlier, but kind of how I'm like thinking about these videos is I think with technology and not only with the state of technology today, but the amount of storage that exists on the internet, right? Like every single person can upload thousands and thousands of videos on YouTube for free, and that is phenomenal. And so I feel like our generation has a specific advantage over previous's in that we'll actually be able to store tons of video evidence of the existence of people that people in the past were never able to. And so I oftentimes think, I'm like, damn, like if no one ever really shares their story like in a very intimate and vulnerable way, there's a possibility that you'll just, everyone just dies, and that story will never be remembered. And so I'm really excited to offer this platform and just like really collect people's stories. And then maybe one day I have this like over, if I'm able to be alive for decades, like have this platform of thousands and thousands of people's stories. And it's really an honor to, have you as the first one. Cause you've really changed my life in so many ways. And I feel like your story very much inspired mine. And so I was like, when I first thought about who do I want to talk to, I was like, it has to be you. So I'm really excited to get deep into your life.
Well, thanks for thinking of me and
Of course.
collecting the stories.
Of course. So let's start from day one. Where were you born?
Day one. Taking it back. I was born actually in Connecticut. Did you know that about me?
I did not know. I'm writing it all down.
I was born in Connecticut and then spent only a few months there. And then my
Hmm.
family moved to Paris, France.
And you went with them.
That, and then we lived in France for 2 years.
And then?
And then, um, and then my parents got divorced, and my mom took me and my sister to New York City.
Hmm. And
It
when
was
was
always,
this? When did you move to back to New York City?
I must have been like 4.
Hmm. So do you remember much of living in Paris or no?
No,
Yeah,
but
none.
apparently I was a super cute, fluent little French kid.
No way.
Yeah,
And did you forget all of that French?
most of it, unfortunately.
Wow. The brain is crazy.
The brain is crazy.
So
Sometimes I surprise myself when it comes back to me, like, but yeah,
hmm.
no longer as fluent as I'd like to be.
So, I mean, if you feel comfortable talking about this, do you still remember details from the divorce or how that kind of played out? And
No, I don't have any memories of my parents together.
mm,
I honestly, I don't even think it was until much, much later that I even started questioning like why my parents weren't together.
mm.
And
So
there,
when do you feel like that started?
I think I was probably like 7 or 8, and kids in school would say, "Oh, your parents are divorced. That's so sad." And I was like, "Oh, is that something I should be sad about?" I don't think I ever felt sad until it was almost like projected onto me.
Mm.
And then it kind of put the idea in my head of, oh, is this a sad thing? Just because it's all I kind of knew. So
Do you feel like if you were in a vacuum where none of those other people's statements entered, how do you think you would have felt about it? No type of way?
I mean, I think I had a great childhood. I had great
Mm,
relationships with both my parents. So yeah, I don't I think yeah, I don't know. I look back on it
fondly.
fondly.
Yeah. Yeah. And so how you talk about how when you were 7 or 8 is when you started kind of becoming aware of this, and children in your school would say these things. What was it like before that, when it was just you, your sister, and your mom? Did you ever ask your mom about your dad, or what was that like for you?
Yeah. I learned later on that behind the scenes they had a really difficult relationship and really never got along. Um, I really admire them for the ways in which they were able to keep that separate from my sister and I. Um, I think the one thing, if they have anything in common, was that they always put us first.
Hmm.
And I think that was the reason why we grew up knowing that both of our parents really, really loved us and having a good relationship with both of them, even though behind the scenes things were kind of rough and
Hmm.
dark. And I look back on it now, knowing what I know, thinking about all the therapy sessions that my sister and I would go to with my mom. So there are like little memories that kind of come back into my mind
Hmm.
that paint a picture that I wasn't aware of before.
Hmm. It's fascinating how our brain can do that. Like, our childhood is just like
Yeah.
this enigma. It doesn't even really exist. And then you like sometimes get a little door that opens. You're like, oh my God, I
I was like, oh,
forgot
it
about
makes
that.
sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
It
Okay.
makes
And
sense in a
so,
new way.
so you were in New York City. You moved there when you're 4 or 5. Did you grow up there after that?
Yep. And then I grew up there, um, moved around a lot. Um,
In New York, though?
yeah, moved
Okay.
around. Yeah, I probably have moved probably a total of like 10 times in New York City,
Hmm.
which was, I think, a reflection of my mom's work situation. And then she also got into like real estate and was able to
Hmm.
do pretty well flipping real estate. So that was another reason why we moved so much. But I kind of liked it. I always liked it. My sister and I were different in that way.
Hmm.
I really embraced the out with the old, in with the new. I was always really excited about those moves.
Hmm.
My sister spent a long time like saying goodbye to each room of the house. And it was a lot more emotionally draining for her,
Hmm.
which I always thought was kind of interesting. Um, we grew up, very, very similarly, but reacted to our circumstances almost opposite most of the time.
Hmm. Would you say
So,
your sister's someone who prefers like consistency and kind of that routine a lot more than you do?
yeah,
That's
absolutely.
very interesting. And
Yeah,
so, what do
she's
you think could possibly lead to like a large difference like that?
a great question. Um, I'm not super sure. I don't know. I think we were maybe just like
Something in the brain.
made
Yeah, something.
differently in
Yeah,
the
I mean,
brain.
genetically. Yeah, I mean, genetically,
Yeah.
you both are different. Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, a lot of people ask me now, like, you're always moving. Like, how are you like doing these things? And something in your brain just clicks to where you start enjoying it. But then I think also at the same time, at some point, your brain might click the opposite direction. You're like, you know what? Now what I want is just, I would like to return to the same house for like 5 years. I think
Yeah,
it's kind of fascinating how you can kind of just switch between those. So you
so
moved
true.
around. Did you live in each borough? Is that kind of how you did it? Or you stayed in one? You stayed in Manhattan? How did that work out?
Yeah, mostly around different spots in Manhattan. As we were moving, I was also changing schools too, which
Hmm.
was interesting. So I was kind of the new kid a lot. Um, I think that's something that really helped me come out of my shell,
Interesting.
even though, yeah, even though it wasn't easy. And you might not believe me now, but when I was a kid, I was very quiet. I was
Hmm.
very quiet. I was very independent. I kind of liked being alone. I was shy and sensitive and didn't really talk a lot.
What age was this? That's funny.
Um, I feel like I wasn't described as outgoing until I was probably like 17,
Mm,
like in high school. Yeah.
wow. And so I'm really interested to hear your experience about this, like new kids. I think there's something so fun about being novel, like being the new thing. People are interested. Have you noticed, because you spent so much of your life in this, do you have a hard time when you move past that phase? Have you had a hard time moving past the novelty phase where you are now like a central piece in a community, and everyone knows you? And have you found parts in your life where you became that point, or have you still stuck in kind of that novelty role throughout your life?
Hmm. That's an interesting question. I guess I do like the novelty kind of position. I feel myself sometimes getting like bored when things are too comfortable or the same all the time. And
Hmm.
then it translates to me being a little spontaneous and perhaps impulsive.
Novelty is addicting.
It is. It is addicting.
So, what was your experience? Because I was never, for me, it's fascinating. I was never a new kid. I mean, I went to the same school from when I was 2 all the way to 18, or whatever,
Wow.
6 to 18. So, I had the same friends. I had never experienced this moving thing, which is why now my life is so like new and different. So, I'm really interested to hear how your experience was like that. So, explain to me, like, what's a day like when you move to a new school and everybody there doesn't know you? What is it like?
Oh, it's
If,
terrifying.
mm,
I, I still, I think it's also terrifying because in a lot of ways, it's the first time you're experiencing those emotions because you're young. Like you don't know what it feels like to, like, you just don't have the experience behind what embarrassment feels like or like being the center of attention in these weird ways or, like being bullied. Like all of these things are kind of first emotions. And so I
mm,
feel like they're almost, I remember them very, very clearly because they were intense and impactful. I remember too, yeah, I was bullied a lot.
mm,
I don't know. I think a part of that was kind of the new kid, um, and maybe me just being kind of quiet,
and
but
quirky.
and quirky. Yeah. Um, yeah, it's funny though. I was picked on a lot, bullied a lot, and was always made to feel really empowered after, which I think was another I don't know, reflection or shout out to my parents. So I remember I came home once. It was like my first week at a new school, and this girl kept calling me weird. She was like, Arden, you're so weird. And I called my dad crying, and I was like, everyone thinks I'm weird. And he said, did you say thank you? And I was like, what? I was like, Dad, you're not listening to the story. And he's like, no, do you want to be normal? Do you want to be like everybody else? He's like, no, you want to be weird. He's like, you want to be different. He's like, next time someone says that, you tell them thank you. That's a compliment. And so the next time it happened, I said thank you. Everyone looked at me like I was crazy and I was probably weirder. But in a lot of ways, like some of the trauma that I faced was transformed into empowering moments for me
Mm.
that yeah. So I think there's a few examples of that. And
Mm.
I think my parents did well,
Do you feel
kind of,
like those experiences kind of built you to be very confident in whatever you wanted to be in that moment from a young age?
yeah, absolutely. I'll never forget once in college, I made a friend and it was kind of our first heart to heart as friends. And he said, Arden, I can tell that you were bullied as a kid. I was like, what? And he said, no, 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 it's a compliment. Like I can tell because you're really empathetic towards others. I thought that was kind of a strange thing to say, but I mean, he meant it as a compliment. And I think, like thinking back to that and thinking back to the ways in which my parents kind of transformed a lot of low moments for me into empowering ones has got me really thinking about, I don't know, I'm going to go on a tangent a little bit, but being an older sister and not wanting my brothers to go through some of the bullying phases that I did, but understanding that life is hard and those moments are going to happen. And when they do happen, the important part is creating the space where you can be empowered by them, where you can be strengthened, where you can come out more empathetic. And I was thinking
Mm,
about this a lot because I think when we think about the qualities of people that we admire, we often use words like they're empathetic, they're compassionate, they're determined, they're driven, they're hardworking. Um, and those are all qualities that don't come from having a perfect life. Those are often qualities that come from experiencing trauma and then getting through it in some way and having people around you who can transform that trauma into an experience that
mm.
you can grow from. So
That's a beautiful saying, a trauma transformer. Like actually, no, that's a beautiful way. So what do you okay, so in the examples that you gave of your dad, for example, it seemed to be like some sort of like clever thing that he would say, right? And so let's say you, for example, don't go through what your kid has gone through and you don't have something clever to respond. Do you have any other ideas on how you can maybe be this person of a trauma transformer for someone else if you don't know what they should do? Are there other ways?
my mind's going blank.
That's okay. No, that's okay. You get what I'm saying though, because I feel like what you're talking about is actually, I mean, my passion about education. I think you're literally nailing on the dot, and I've never actually. What you just said right now is so just uh, big for me because I think like this concept of is beautiful that all these traits that you said that are typically looked at as at a virtuous person are not built through like, oh, my life has been so nice. I mean, it is always the whatever it is that you have to struggle for, even if it's to make your local soccer team, even whatever it is where you have to be like, I have to believe in myself and push myself farther than I'm used to or out of my comfort zone, is where that building happens. And so
Mhm.
someone can't, I think a lot of times my parents and I've seen other parents, they believe that parenting should be to just protect your kids from suffering altogether. But you bring up a really interesting term of that's not necessarily your job, but you should maybe give them the tools to transform their trauma into a lesson or into something that they can keep with them as opposed to just simply protecting them, which I think is a really profound statement. So I guess like where my question comes from is a lot of times I think your kids will go through trauma that you have never experienced. And so I think the experiences you gave are things that where the other person can kind of offer some sort of insight or wisdom. But there are things, for example, that I will never understand because I haven't gone through or I don't just understand. And so I'm trying to think, are there ways to maybe help someone transform that trauma? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Honestly, I think also it can just be just that, right? I mean, recognizing, hey, I don't know what it feels like to be you right now, but it sounds to me like that's a really difficult experience. I can imagine that you feel really overwhelmed or frustrated or hurt by this. But I
Mm,
think even just that in and of itself, what you've said, acknowledging like, hey, I haven't had this experience. Let me not pretend I know what it's like. Let me hear you. Let me see you. Let me acknowledge that like this is this is your experience.
mm,
I think that can be I think that can be in and of itself a really powerful like coping mechanism and tool to
mm.
support someone.
And I would say this about you. I mean, I think there's one thing that you actually told me that really multiple things, but this one, as of relate, that really kind of shifted my perspective. So I had a friend tell me that he was scared for the meditation retreat that he was going to do. Literally a day before I told you this. And I had responded to him so differently. I was like, I gave him like a bunch of reasons. I was like, come on, man. Like at the end of the day, you can always leave. Like it's never, it's never going to be bad enough to the point where you have to stay there. So we got this. But it was more from a place of also trying to reassure myself that I shouldn't be scared. But I told you I was scared. And what you said was that's good. Like it's okay to be scared, and it's good for you to be scared because change only comes from being scared. And that was like really interesting to me because like I actually had to face the fact that I was afraid. It wasn't that like let me just like find a way to like logically and intellectually just like negate my feeling, because that's typically how I respond to a feeling. Oh, I don't like this feeling, let me logic it out. But
Hmm.
actually being like, oh, this is how I feel and it's okay, I think was really powerful when you said that. And so my question for you is, when people come to you, how do you know what type of what they're looking for? Like in that moment that was perfect, but other times maybe I actually wanted advice, right? Like how can you like kind of tell based on what they're coming to you for, like what type of help they need? Because I have a really hard time with that. I never know what people want.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, and it's always nice to want to support your friends in the way that they need to be supported for sure. And I think
Mm-hmm.
it's easy to miss. It's easy to miss that mark, right? But I
Yeah,
think,
very.
I don't know. I think people in general often give advice that they don't take themselves, which
Mm.
is which is interesting. So I try to um I try to think about what maybe I would want in that moment and then share it with other people. Or
Mm.
um
I mean that's a
um,
really, I don't do that.
I think it's also I think very often too people are just kind of hard on themselves. I think just giving people the space to feel emotions and like just tell them, "Hey, that's okay. Like thanks for sharing that with me. Why don't you embrace that emotion?" Going back to also what we were talking about earlier, a little bit with how we kind of strengthen and empower ourselves through difficult feelings or experiences. I think being scared can be really uncomfortable, but I also think it's the moments where we are not is really beautiful and that's something that they should be excited for.
Mm. You kind of broke out there. I think one of our
Oh,
Wi-Fi's kind of.
sorry.
Can you repeat what you just started? The last like 10 seconds.
Okay.
If you remember, it's hard. That's impossible. It's almost impossible. If you asked me that, I couldn't do that. So try your
Um,
best. What was the gist?
I think the gist was I think those emotions are all a part of the human experience. And I
Mm.
think we are oftentimes people in general are really hard on themselves when they experience those emotions. We don't want to be
Mm.
sad, we don't want to be afraid. And so we try to limit the amount of time that we are experiencing those things, which makes
Mm.
sense, absolutely. But tying it back to our earlier conversation too, to make improvements on ourselves to be empowered or transformed or just better ourselves, those don't come generally from moments where we're happy. They
Mm.
generally come from moments where we're not happy, where we're scared. We're terrified, when we're really, really sad. It's those moments where we learn the most about ourselves, and that can be the most transformative. And so I think when someone comes to me in those low moments, I my advice generally to them is to embrace it. That's
Mm.
what being human is, and reminding them that what comes after that is something they should be really excited for. When
Mm.
we're really, really scared, it's often when we recognize that we're actually maybe a lot stronger than we thought we were.
Mm. Damn. And that we're
And
actually capable of beating what we were afraid of before, and we're
yeah,
almost there. Wow.
exactly.
Wow. It's really like re-looking at fear is, I think, one of the most powerful things that you can do. Like someone was asking, how do you manifest your intelligence? And I feel like one way to simply, like, to say a virtue that I hold is that fear is just simply something that is a green light for me to go try something. Like, I feel like that virtue in itself is so powerful, and my life has changed so much ever since I started looking at fear as like, oh, this is actually a challenge, as opposed to like, oh, this is an indication that I should never do this.
Or maybe an opportunity. It can also be an
Mm.
opportunity to explore something, to push yourself,
Mm.
to challenge yourself, to see what you're really capable of. an opportunity to like look a little bit deeper inside yourself.
Mm.
Because I think the question often too is, what are you afraid of? Like,
Out.
what are you actually afraid of?
Yeah.
And I think
So
there's usually deeper levels
yeah. So I
to
think
why
you
people feel afraid.
I think you did a great job of asking yourself the next question.
Oh no.
So what are you afraid of? What are
Oh.
you really afraid of?
What am I really afraid of? I think, well, the first one that comes to mind is flying.
Yeah, that one's an interesting one.
That is an interesting one for me. That continues to be a challenge, but
But you
doesn't
do it a
stop me
lot
from
too. Yeah,
traveling.
that's true. Like you do it
So,
a ton. So
yeah.
has it gone
And
down over time?
I don't think that that process is linear.
Mm,
Sometimes I make good steps and sometimes I get set back, but it's a work in progress. And I think as long as we don't allow it to keep us from doing what we love, then
it's okay.
that's the important part.
Yeah.
I think we're getting deep. I mean, I think everyone feels a similar fear of like losing someone that they love. I think
Mm.
that's been a fear of mine.
Well, I want to get back to, so you said from 10 or from, 4 when you grew up there until 18, you were in New York. And so what did you do when you graduated high school?
So I call this part of my life my quarter life crisis.
Mm.
Um, I graduated high school and kind of went through the motions that one is supposed to go through, quote unquote, supposed to go through. At that time, I applied to colleges, I got into college. I was just never excited about the process, but I was doing it because that was the track, the, the next step, the obvious next step that was expected of you. And so I went through those motions, but again, I really was not excited about it and was really thinking about, okay, if it's not college, then what is it? Like I want so much more, but I don't know what that is. Um, and so I was looking at other options and I thought about being an au pair in France, like a live-in babysitter in France. French was something I was trying to get back to, and I knew people in France who would take me, so that seemed like an option on the table. Um, I hadn't really shared a lot of these thoughts with my family or anything. And if I did, they were kind of quickly kind of dismissed as, oh, that's a nice thought. Those are nice dreams. Um, so I eventually found this program called Thinking Beyond Borders.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I applied and they needed to like interview your family. And I begged my mom to take this interview and give me the chance to get into this program and go. And um, shit, that's not how it went.
How'd it go?
I missed a step. Well, I got into the program and I I didn't think I was going to get in. And I got in and I was really, really excited about it. But I hadn't told my mom at this point. And I didn't have enough guts to tell her until college orientation rolled around and I didn't go to college orientation because I deferred my admissions. So she
And you didn't
confronted
tell her?
me. I didn't tell her. And she said, aren't you supposed to be at orientation? And I was like, yeah, I'm not gonna go to that because I
Wow.
deferred my admissions. And she freaked out.
I
And
bet.
she was like, you better call them back and beg for your spot back. And, at that moment, I really thought I had made a terrible mistake. I had no actual plan.
Mm.
I just knew that I didn't want to go to school right away and I trusted that I was going to figure it out. But um, yeah, that scared me. And I thought about calling them back and begging for my spot back. Um, but I got into this gap year program and then begged my mom to take this interview to let me go. And she did. And then I was like, I will do anything to go on this program. You, I was like, I can't afford it on my own. I really need your support. I I was like, I will give you all the money in my bank account if you can help me go on this. I traded in like savings bonds that my grandfather had left behind, um, and I got to go. So
So
I,
explain what this is. So it's thinking.
yeah, it's called Thinking Beyond Borders, and I traveled with a group of 10 other students and three peer leaders um, for 10 months. We traveled and lived with homestay families and did community service work and studied on various issues related to international development. So
Hmm.
the full kind of schedule was we started in Costa Rica with just orientation, kind of prep stuff. We went to Ecuador and lived in the mountains and studied ecotourism. And we replanted trees that were lost to deforestation and built plant nurseries. And then we went to Peru, hiked the Inca Trail. Um, then we went to South Africa and mirrored caregivers in townships. And the theme was just learning about healthcare systems. And then went to India, studied education, and worked with women's groups and um, teaching women computers, as well as in elementary schools. And then we went to China, studied agriculture, and we lived in rural China and farmed every day. And then we went to Cambodia for an enrichment week and learned about some of the history there. And then we actually came back to the United States and spent 2 weeks in a cabin with no cell service or anything. And they asked us essentially to make a presentation. What did you learn? Could be anything. It could be
Hmm.
any format. It could be any lesson. They said, just share with us what this experience has been like. Take 2 weeks, go walk in nature, reflect on the last 10 months, and then share. And then we like officially graduated in the capital and all gave our presentations. I wrote a 10-minute poem that rhymes.
Oh no!
It's great.
If it rhymes, I'm
It's
scared.
great.
I had a good time.
Oh.
I ate some tasty limes.
Oh, it's better than that. Give me a little more credit. Oh, it's great. I think my whole takeaway was reflecting on why I wanted to do this program in the beginning, and
Yeah,
I really wanted to help people. It sounds
yeah.
naive to say now, but I really wanted to help people, and I think the conclusion that I came with was that I'm not actually sure I helped anyone, but
Mm.
the people that I met really helped me, and I was truly transformed into kind of an agent of change
Mm.
um,
So
from
you went in
the
with the
people along
savior
the way.
vibes.
I really did, though. I mean, I can be honest about that now. I did,
Yeah,
and I came out, you know, learning learning the most about
most.
myself and the world and kind of the role that I wanted to play in
Wow.
it. And so
So
I
for sorry,
am
quick
really
interruption.
thankful.
Quick interruption.
Yeah.
Did you do that when you were 18?
Yes,
That's
I was 18.
amazing. I mean, like, so much of my education stuff is literally just about that experience that you had. Like, how much more do you think you learned in that 10 months than anyone who went to Stanford, Harvard? It doesn't matter what school they went to. Like, what did that feel like?
I don't know if I've ever had a year where I've learned more.
I
Yeah.
can't
It was
imagine. Yeah.
truly, truly transformative. And one thing I thought of when you asked the question too, my dad always used to say, don't let classes get in the way of your education. And I think that's also a perfect kind of descriptor of what this experience was like.
Yeah. And so, do you think, personal opinion, because I think the eventual goal for me is I would like to create a system where every student embedded in their curriculum work, have experiences like this, even if it's a month, a year, whatever it is. Do you think it's possible to do this where it's not so expensive? Where you can go work at a local farm, or you can do things inside even your own country to at the very least cut down on costs of traveling. Do you think like the
Yeah,
expensive element of it is kind of a necessity?
no, absolutely not. I think there are opportunities everywhere. It makes me sad that at least in the United States, it's very kind of frowned upon for people to take breaks and just explore a little bit.
Yeah.
I got a lot of really negative feedback when I told people I wasn't going to school right away and I was
Mm.
taking a gap year. There was a lot of negativity, and a lot of it was, oh well, oh you're never going to go to college. Oh, I was like I was like oddly this dropout, who was
Mm.
never going to continue on to higher education, and that must have really been going through something, or what were my parents thinking letting me go on this trip. And I look back and it's the best thing I've ever done. And now that I talk about it, people are very interested and they're like, wow, what an amazing opportunity. But
But
before
at
I
the
went, it
time,
was
yeah,
at the
100%.
time, it was I was
A
unhinged
menace,
and
yeah.
off track. So it's just interesting.
Fascinating.
That shift is really interesting. And I
Mm.
wish there was more encouragement for 18-year-olds who shouldn't know what they want to do in the world. I wish there was more encouragement to like be curious. And I
Mm.
wish there was more support to be curious. I think taking a year off just to explore, and by that I mean like volunteer at a local animal shelter if you're curious about animals, if you're curious
Yeah.
about food, go work on a farm and learn about where food comes from. Um, I think I think it's incredibly beneficial, and I just wish that more young people had the space and the option to feel supported in that.
Mm. And so, did you say, I think you bring up a great point. Do you feel like this experience helped you kind of figure out what you wanted to do more, or it just made you even more confused because you saw how many more options there were?
No, I definitely kind of was able to grasp some of the themes that I was really curious and passionate about. So by the time I did go to school, and yes, I did go back to school, despite what everyone is going to say,
To all those
um,
aunties out there.
let them know.
Yeah.
Um, I went back to school and I knew I had a much clearer idea of what I wanted to study, and I ended up creating my
Mm.
own major. Um, so
And also I wanted to say, something I'm thinking about is not only there's two really interesting things that you said. One, that a lot of people assume that, oh, you didn't go to college right after, that you'll never go, which like assumes that college is like one of these things that if you don't just blindly do, you won't go back because you won't think there's a need, or you just. But it's like that's actually kind of wild. It's like if college, it's truly a place where your life will be improved and all these opportunities, why would you not want to go back? Like I think
exactly.
like someone else was saying that today actually. They're like, yeah, I did my PhD straight out of my undergrad because if I didn't do it, then I don't think I would have ever done it. Which is just like an interesting concept because it's like as I get older, I'm realizing like if education truly has value, then I don't need to like trick myself into doing it today. Like if it really has value, even if I do other things and I'm like, that's actually a amazing opportunity, I'll come back to it. Like it's only if like, oh, as soon as I see more in life, I'm never gonna come back to this. And you have to really question, is this really something worth doing for you in specific?
That's so true. It's also the value that we place on college, to like the direct connection that we make to people going to college and like education. Like that's it's like if you didn't go to college, you're also not smart. Like I think there's so many other ways to
Mm,
be educated and to grow. Like I don't think college is the end all be all. I'm not saying don't go to college. Like absolutely that's great, but the weight that that carries
mm,
is a, a little bit lost sometimes, I think.
mm.
Um I was going to say something else. I lost my train of thought. It'll come to me.
Yeah. No, so okay, so I mean, this year was just such, sounds like such a magnificent episode. We could talk for 10 hours just about what you saw here, it would be endless. So I'm really trying to be like, do I want to really go into in depth on this experience, or should we get to the rest of your life? Because I mean, both are fascinating. I think you've just had such an interesting path and journey through your life where it's like it's uniquely you. And I think everyone's path is in a way uniquely them, but I think um, the more people kind of exert their own like influence on their own life, it's like you just see all these beautiful prats and curves, and then when you see the end product, obviously you're not that old, it's not your end product yet, but seeing where you are now, it's just cool to be like, whoa, Maidan happened and this, it's like cool. So I'm curious to maybe get a little more through. So you did 18, this was 18, and then did you go to college when you were 20 or 19?
And then I went to college shortly after that. So I took the year off. I went to college when I was, I guess, yeah, 19. It was a rough transition. I'm not gonna lie. Let it be known. It was a rough transition going into school. I think I had just I had been kind of independent, traveling, seeing the world, and then was put in kind of a rural setting with a lot of people who were kind of feeling independent for the first time in their life. And so that was something I
Mm,
kind of struggled to relate to, where people around me more often than not felt like they had this newfound freedom, whereas I felt like majority of my freedom had been taken away from me. And so
mm,
it was a rough kind of social transition and just like mental transition. Um, I think the reverse culture shock was probably the hardest part of the whole gap year, and maybe not something that a lot of people talk about after big travel experiences. The like coming back and being a different person trying to fit into old routines, like that
damn,
clash
yeah.
is really overwhelming.
Mm.
And it threw me off guard because I wasn't expecting that. Do you feel similarly after your big trip?
I mean, yeah, I would say one benefit I have is I feel like the people that I have in my life now, I like were part of the trip with me in many ways. Like every week I would call them, update them on not what I'm doing, but like psychologically and philosophically what changes happened over that week. So I feel like a lot of them experienced the growth with me, and so when I came back, it wasn't like, oh, I have to introduce myself to a new Gautam. They kind of already knew. So I think in that way it was really really helpful. And also I
Yeah.
don't know many people, so I had to do that with like five. So that in many ways I don't have enough of a community to actually be held accountable to stay someone. So I didn't feel
Mm.
that because so yeah, so I didn't feel that in that exact story, but I 100% on anyone who walks back into a large family or any place where they kind of are expected to be someone. I mean, and you did it for a year, and I think your experience was just so much more. At 18 years old, if I saw that, I don't.
Yeah.
My brain would have exploded. Are you kidding me? If I like
Yeah.
I think the moment you like experience the world's suffering, I feel like your brain just snaps differently, And I think like growing up in America,
Hmm.
in a privileged environment around people who had privileged problems, like I didn't realize like it took me a lot longer and later in my life to realize like damn, like the world, there's people who have, and I think as soon as you start traveling, you see that more, And I think,
Yeah.
but nowadays I think you can see more than enough of that in America itself.
Hmm.
But growing up, I
Yeah.
feel like I didn't see it that much.
Yeah. The
Um,
perspective is important. You may have
yeah.
problems, but they may be good problems to have.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, wow. And so, okay, so you came back. Thank you for sharing that. It's a very profound statement that you say. You'd be dropping dimes, like I think like I would say this. I would say people who are philosophically trained. I would say like they didn't gain their wisdom experientially. They gained it from reading a book, which is like one type of wisdom. Like you can read all these amazing philosophers and come to all these wisdom and be like, oh, well, I can say X, Y, and Z. I mean, a lot of things I know I did not physically experience. I read. And then I like, well, that's a good idea. Let me put this good idea from this philosopher and that good idea from that biologist and put it all together. But you came up with all of this through your own experience, which I think is like so much more cool. And I think it also like sticks in a much more like profound way because it's something that you experience. It's not something you just read that can be like shook. like very
Yeah.
easily, you know? And so it's like something that really is built in your bones, which I think is so cool.
Thanks. Yeah, I think so too. There's definitely many different ways of consuming knowledge. I the thought that I was going to share earlier that I forgot too, um, about people who take gap years and people who kind of just like go through the motions of school to school to school. I think another problem with that, not necessarily problem with that, but like maybe reflection is that I think that the only thing that prepares you for life is life itself.
Mm,
And so I think, you know, these experiences before I went to college were really, really helpful because I had life experience that then could be matched with the book knowledge that we were kind of talking about.
mm,
And so to have those two things complementing each other really transformed the type of student that I could grow into. And I
wow.
think someone who just goes through years and years of school, 100%, they're, you know, educated in their own way, but oftentimes are not fully prepared for life after that because they haven't had too many of those
Mm,
life experiences.
mm.
And sitting in a classroom and reading about them all day,
It's just, yeah, it's just not
just, you
it.
know, it's
It's
not it.
literally not it. No,
there's
100%.
there's
Yeah,
a big
coming back
piece
to the
missing.
classroom. Coming back to the classroom has really like it made me very astutely aware of that. Like I'm like, this is just not it. I'm not, this is like just different from what the world looks like in so many ways. And so 19, you go back to school, and how long are you there for?
19, I go back to school. It's a 4 year degree. And I looked for every opportunity that I could have to do it traveling. So I
Mm.
spent 3 semesters abroad.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah. One was during the summer. I applied for a grant and I took it to Costa Rica. So it was like a 1 credit situation. And I decided on Costa Rica, which was kind of outside of my degree a little bit, but I kind of used it um, to fulfill a science requirement and a personal kind of curiosity that I had. And I'm maybe not proud of this. Like I had a moment that I was in New York City. I grew up in New York City. I had a moment, I think it was, you know, shortly after my gap year where I was just looking at grocery store food differently. And I was like, wow, I don't know what this food looks like in the ground. And that
Mm.
really bothered me. And so it was kind of a thought that was reoccurring in college. And so one of the semesters, I was like, I'm going to take this opportunity to go learn about where my food comes from. And so I
Mm.
went to Costa Rica for 3 months in the summer.
You went
Um,
with for a university or what?
yeah, I got this grant and I took the grant and got approved to have this count as 1 credit. And I volunteered on an organic farm. I reached out to somebody I had met traveling along the way who started an organic farm, and I said, "Hi, I'd love to learn from you. Can I live on your property in
Is it like
exchange
was it
for
woofing? Were
work?"
you woofing?
No, it was a guy
Oh,
that I
cool.
had
Oh,
met
cool.
traveling,
That's cool.
and he was running a hostel at the time,
Mm.
and it was always his dream to have his own organic farm that kind of supplied food for his community.
Mm.
And he eventually did that. So that was like 3 years later. And I stayed in contact with him and I was like, I've had this curiosity and maybe this insecurity a little bit of not knowing where my food comes from and wanting to be closer to that. So use the opportunity with this grant to live in a tent on his property and farm with him every day and learn about where my food comes from and how compost is made, and it was great. And then the other 2 semesters that I spent abroad, I studied in Senegal and then Rwanda. I chose Senegal for, I mean, one, the French component, and was studying national identity and arts there. And then the second semester was in Rwanda, studying genocide and reconciliation.
The thing I'm kind of shook with right now is like each one of these things deserves like 30 minutes on its own. Like I feel like it doesn't do it
Which one you want
justice.
to break
You
down?
know, like it doesn't do it justice because you're just like throwing these names out which mean nothing. You know, it's like I mean each one of these countries is like a beautiful experience on its own, which
Absolutely.
you know, and it's like I feel like it does these experiences a disservice to simply just say them. And I feel like I really want to go in depth, but you just can't because one, it happened a long time ago, so like the freshness when those things
Yeah.
happen, you know, is just so different than when you've experienced a million things after, and then they're more kind of just like I kept these two or three pieces of wisdom with me, but it's like the you know
Very
the more
true.
essential, like yeah, I mean it's when you just come off it, it's like whoa, you know, and then even weeks after you kind of forget some of the more
I should have brought my
raw.
journals.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, just read through all of them.
My journals are my most prized possession, I
Yeah,
think, because they hold all
the thoughts
the
and
real thoughts,
yeah, I mean,
the
because I
new
mean,
thoughts.
it's fascinating. I think, okay, so I mean, you know, I think one question that I really want to ask you is, you know, I have a lot of women in my life, and when we talk about you know these type of you know traveling, it usually comes from well, you're a male, so you can travel. You know, like I'm a woman, and it's not the same. I can't do that.
Mm.
And so I'm curious with what your experience was like when it comes to, you know, just all the things that women experience traveling. What was it like for you? Did you feel were you scared at first, and maybe you kind of grew out of that? Did you learn how to handle yourself in many situations? I would love to hear more about what that entire journey was like for you.
Yeah. I think I think I was most challenged um by traveling as a woman in two places that kind of come to mind. Um, one was in India during my gap year, and that was just challenging because the gender dynamic was really unequal. Um, I was followed a few times. I didn't have to cover my head, but I often did because I was getting a lot of like positive and negative attention, just like attention across the board, and um, really didn't like that. And once I was followed a few times, that was scary. And being a woman, you can't talk back to men either. I think another experience that comes to mind in India was when my host mom approached me and tried to have a conversation with me about my period. And she said, "Oh, when that happens, you need to tell me." So when it happened, I told her, and she said, "Okay, so for as long as you have your period, here are the new rules." And my bed sheets were washed every day. I was not allowed in any worship spaces. I was also not allowed in the kitchen. I was considered to be in an impure state, and entering into those spaces would spoil all of the food. And my dishes had to be washed separately. So after every meal, I would take my dishes and I would walk outside down the alley and I would wash my dishes with a hose at the back of the alley. Um, I think there was a lot in this situation that I didn't fully understand and a lot that I didn't agree with. But I think the important thing about traveling is embracing those differences and being respectful of the culture. And if you're staying with family, the family that you're staying with. So I followed the rules, even though maybe I didn't like them or agree. But it was, yeah, that was one example. I think Senegal was another one with very kind of clear gender roles and gender dynamics. I think Senegal was also interesting to me with the way beauty was conceived. Um, I was in Senegal and I started my research on the music scene and how music was being used politically. And I ended up changing what I was working on because I had so many experiences regarding the way that I looked. Um, and so I was really fascinated by like exploring that a little bit further with what beauty was was. I think my host family was disappointed when I showed up because their understanding of American culture was like the Kardashians. And so then I show up and I'm not what they expect and maybe not what they wanted. So I got a lot of comments about why do I wear glasses and I shouldn't wear glasses or I should be wearing more makeup or um I was way too skinny. That was a big one. They flat out said, you know, this is embarrassing for us. And would always save me an extra plate of food. And in Senegal, and this is I just am speaking to my experience. I won't I won't speak for Senegal as a whole from my experience. Um, Senegalese women tend to be like bigger, and that's a sign of kind of beauty and being taken care of. And um, so when I showed up, I was too slender for their liking. Um, yeah, so those are kind of two examples that come to mind that shook me a little bit being a woman traveling.
Yeah, and I think thanks for sharing all of that. First, I feel like it's sometimes hard to, um, especially in today's like climate of kind of just like to talk about cultural differences, because I mean, to act as if all cultures are the same is actually kind of ridiculous. And so I have a hard time with this a lot of the times, like talking about my experiences of my culture, because a lot of things are really different. And when looked at through a Western lens and ethical framework, it's not great. But if you look at it through like the perspective and reasoning of why like other cultures actually do what they do, it's not like oftentimes like it just takes a little bit of a perspective shift, and I feel like that's
Hmm.
why I've always had a hard time even like understanding ethics from such a young age, because like there are many things that my culture does that in America is wrong, and the opposite too. There's many things that we do in America that's awful in my culture, and so it's like there's not necessarily like one uh ethical framework that just like encompasses the entire globe. And so like being able to like put yourself into a different culture and understanding, and then that's where I think ethics get really interesting, where it's like, oh, but should there be some like objective good and bad, so we can at least provide some basic level of like
Hmm.
human protection for all people. So yeah, it's an interesting conversation there, like when does cultural differences cross a line that's too far.
Right.
And so I'm assuming that you probably were thinking a lot about that in your experiences as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. I took in college, I wrote a lot about my experience for my gap year. I mean, that was what I had spent a year doing. And so a lot of the work that I was kind of pulling from in college was from my gap year. And I remember I was in a theater class, which was very outside my comfort zone, but I was required to take this theater class and we were required to do a monologue. And I presented a monologue about my experience getting my period in India, um, and shared it with the theater full of people. And I remember this girl comes over to me after the show, like upset. And she was like, "Thank you so much for sharing. I really felt like the oppression that you felt as a woman in India." And she kind of goes on about what my monologue had meant to her and the oppression that like women face around their period. And it was really interesting because that's not really how I felt. And
Mm.
I thought it was really interesting that that's how she felt with my story. Um, I don't know, just
No, it's no 100%. I feel like I have always had the hardest time explaining it to people who aren't really like culturally, who have experienced different cultures, but not from a lens of like, oh, like I'm American and therefore this is better than all other things, and like people who've actually truly experienced different cultures that are vastly different, but from like a, okay, let me just experience this and not be like one is better than the other. I think for people who don't do that, every time I try to explain my culture, I have to like, but it's, I have to like, also add that, oh, but it's not worse though. Oh, but it's not, like it's just different. And it's hard to kind of
Right.
explain that. Like, I guess that it becomes a really interesting question. Like, is different possible without better? And I think that's a really, really interesting question. I'm not sure what I feel, but I think at the surface level, everyone wants to say, yeah, different is possible without better,
Hmm.
But if that's whether actually possible or not, I think is more. It's yeah, I'm not sure, but it's interesting.
Yeah, it is. It is. It is a really interesting question. I think that's also the beauty of traveling and why I would encourage everyone to travel because it puts into perspective the lives that different people lead that are just different and it
Yeah,
adds perspective to your own life.
well
Um,
said. And I wanted to also touch on this because I met a lot of people in Europe who talked about the difference between traveling and vacation. And I think like I mean and even just in traveling, I think there's millions of ways to travel. And so in your experience, what would you say what is your philosophy towards traveling? What do you define traveling to be? What are the commonalities? What are you looking for when you travel?
when I travel, I'm really looking to travel. I aim for the authentic kind of experiences of embracing another culture. And oftentimes that's uncomfortable. And so it's not the kind of vacation that you're talking about. I think vacation, you're striving to have fun, you're striving to relax. And I think that's wonderful. That's great. If that's your intention, for sure. I love vacationing too. But I think traveling is different. Traveling means I think you often go outside of the cities. Cities are cities are wonderful, but they're often not an accurate representation of what that country is like and what the country has to offer. So I think one way that traveling can happen is in rural environments. See the city, but see outside of the city.
Mm,
And so that's one kind of conscious effort that I always make when traveling is to go to rural spots.
mm. Any other advice?
Honestly, I think food is a huge one.
Food.
I'm a big foodie, but I think
Mm,
food is also so, I mean, everyone eats. And I think food is such a beautiful way to connect with people, whether you speak the same language or you don't. I think so much kind of community can be built around breaking bread with someone, quote
mm,
unquote. I think it's a great way to have cultural exchanges. It's a great way to welcome somebody, thank somebody, learn more about them. Again, whether you speak the same language or not, I think it can happen either way.
well said. Yeah, I mean, and if I was to add on, I'd say food, dancing, like trying to learn some of the
Dancing.
nuances of the language, figuring out like how they, even the smallest, how they greet each other. There's so many different ways to do that,
Hmm.
and what like respect between elders and what the power dynamics of age looks like, gender looks like,
Hmm.
what what the lines that are driven by race and wealth, and it just there's so many things, and each culture handles it differently. Each culture has its own problems and issues that they're battling with, and understanding why some of those are happening. It's just so many lessons. I mean, I think that's
So many
beautiful.
lessons.
And
I think that's also an important part of traveling that you're touching on too, is not only going to those places and being really open-minded and asking questions about them, sure, but I also think like prepping before you go, like learning a few
mm,
words of the local language, learning what the customs are so you don't accidentally offend anyone. All of those little
mm,
extra steps, I think, makes us smarter travelers and a little bit more
mm,
responsible in the way that we're striving to have cultural
mm.
exchanges.
Well said,
And
and
I'll,
respectful.
yeah, it's respectful. Like people, in my experience, like generally also appreciate when
Yeah.
you're even if you learn a few words and you butcher them, the attempt I think shows the intention, and
Mm,
that can be a powerful way to open up an
mm,
exchange of some kind. And I'll give another kind of
mm-hmm,
short example. Traveling in Senegal, there was a lot of cultural differences that I really took some getting used to.
mm,
One was like looking your elders in the eye. I think in our culture, it's disrespectful to not look somebody in the eye.
mm,
And in Senegalese culture, again from my experience, um, it's considered very disrespectful to look someone in the eye, especially someone who's older or somehow like like higher ranked in some way than you.
mm. And so where are you supposed to look instead?
Just down.
Oh, you're just like looking at your feet while talking to someone?
Yeah,
Oh,
which
interesting.
which which felt so unnatural to
Yeah,
me
yeah,
in
yeah.
so many ways because you feel like you're being disrespectful, but in actuality, like
Interesting. That's fascinating.
it would be disrespectful to the opposite. So
Mm.
that's one thing. Yeah.
Wow. And so, I guess there's just still so much more. I feel like, I'm even thinking about this podcast. I'm like, when you start talking about people's lives, like 1 hour is not enough, but you really in theory need maybe a week, like if not more. I mean, you
We'll go on
might,
a retreat
yeah, you need
together for
like
your
like
podcast.
literally like just like I mean actually to really get a deep dive of someone, like an hour is nothing. And because it's like you have to one say what happened, that takes enough time, and then you have to explain what you learned from it, and then you have to explain how that learning has evolved over time and matured with wine, and then you have to talk about how it's impacting you today, and then you have to talk about
Yeah.
every single event like that, and it's like that just one event will take so much breaking down like that. And so it's
Life
like,
is really crazy.
and there's like, you
Yeah.
got to talk about, what's happened in terms of your relationship with love, what's happened with your relationship with your parents. You have to talk about your relationship and transformation with your religion, or your growth in spirituality. You have to talk about physical ailments, what happened there. You have to talk about like lucky things that happen in your life. You have to talk about your career. You got to talk about your education. You got to talk about injuries. You got to talk about mental illness. Like there's like just, it's endless. So it's like,
This is how I feel in therapy. I'm like, there's too much to go through.
yeah. So what I'm learning now is I don't know anything about you, which I think is like the most humbling thing you can probably take away from something like this. I don't know you at all. I know like a brief glimpse of who you present yourself to be today to the outside
Mhm.
world. That's it. But like all that you have seen and done, and I have no idea. And so that's
So can
like,
a person really ever know
no,
another person?
no. And I think that's
No.
why when we say these words of like I love this person, or I think they all kind of don't are very meaningless. It's more like the very current iteration of who you are today, and that you choose to present yourself. You like choose to put on the outfit that you chose to and wear and say the words that you do. And so all I interact with is who you are very willfully presenting to me, not even to other people, just to me. And so it's like you can maybe say I like that, or you can say I like how that makes me feel. Like it's just there's so many levels of wow, I'm not actually interacting at all with who you really are.
Because then there's also like infinite versions of
Yeah,
you and infinite versions of me. Like there's the
exactly.
Gautam version of me, but
Yeah,
then there's a different version of me with this other person.
yeah. And you're changing every minute and every hour. And so who I'm interacting with you now is not who I interacted with you yesterday. And so it's just like it's crazy. Yeah, like that concept was one that was talked a lot about in the meditation retreat as well, where it's like for the simplicity of conversation, it's good to be like, oh, this, give someone a name and then keep them with the name, because it helps for conversation, for communication. If someone in the community died, for example, it's good to have one name, so you don't have to be like, oh, the present version of them at this very current moment
Hmm.
has ceased to exist. Like you don't need to say that. But from like a purely like experiential place, like there's no need to be like, oh, you are the same person. It's actually quite, I think experientially you can be like, oh, I'm going to experience you again differently today. Like every time it's like a new
Mm.
experience, and I think that's one virtue that can maybe even keep relationships more healthy and more engaging, where you never feel like you know that person, and every day you're learning who they are, who they choose to be that day. And so it's kind of like a mystery every single day. And I think in theory, I would like to keep that mentality moving forward with every person I meet. And I think conversations like this really help because you realize, oh man, I know nothing. And you have this again, you dig up a few more things and you're like, all right, I know nothing, you know?
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. And I think that's a great way, a great perspective to kind of have as you develop relationships with people around you. It's funny, as you were talking too, I was thinking about this extra element of like social media that truly is the like tailored versions of ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wild.
So, I wanted to I think we need a part two. Maybe we need. Maybe I do. What do you think? I can't. I don't think I can do like 2 3 parts with every human being. So somehow I'm gonna have to. And I don't think most people will have more time than like hour and a half at max to be like I'm willing to talk about my life. And so I'd somehow have to fit everything in there, which is just impossible.
Yeah, maybe it is too impossible. Maybe like what if you do it like this? You did like, am I speaking on the record? I don't know.
Yeah, you speak on the record.
Okay. What if you did it like the first 20 minutes is kind of a background of that person? Where
Yeah.
are they from? How has their childhood kind of impacted them into adulthood? And then maybe it becomes like more themed. Like
Hmm.
maybe you have like a prep meeting with this person and you talk about like so much of my experience has been related to travel.
Travel. Yeah.
It's something that I it's something I seek out. It's my most transformative moments have been traveling.
Hmm.
And so that can be the theme that I want to explore with you. And then maybe there's a different theme from somebody else. Maybe it's their education path, maybe it's their
Hmm. Okay. You know
time in
why?
the
You know
military or
why I don't
something
want to
or
do that? Because that's what my
oh.
other podcast is. I find
Mm,
something very specific to them and then I like focus on that. But I think that like minimalizes who you are. Like you are not a traveler. That's just like one thing that's like happened in your life that
true.
is you're so much more than that. And so like for the sake of like people want being quote unquote interested, definitely that's a move. So that's why my re-educate podcast is really focused on pick one thing about you and I'll focus on that. But I minimalize every single guest that comes on because that's all they are. All they are
Interesting.
is the person who talks about that. They're not a human being.
Yeah.
They're an
So
expert
maybe
in this
it's
one
easier
field.
to like maybe it's easier than to like not go linear in someone's life
Like in
of like,
time.
okay, what was your childhood like? What was high school? What was college?
Yeah.
I think also it's going to be a lot harder once you have like older guests too
Yeah.
to
Man,
kind of
it's
go
gonna be
down the linear
cool. It's gonna
like
be
the
people's
linear
lives are
path might
so
be
cool. Like are people's
people's
lives
lives
not
are
so
so
cool?
cool.
Like so much happens. Like so much happens. Like even if you talk to a 12, 13-year old, like just so much has happened in their little lives that's like cool. Life is cool. Like once you
Life
get
is
to
so
share it, like
cool.
once you have to share it. I just feel like there's no need for you to be the CEO of a company. You don't have to accomplish anything. Simply just experiencing your life like fully, you'll have a lot of stories to share. You know? Like
There's a really amazing like indigenous like saying. I'll have to find it and then I'll send it to you.
mhm.
But it really is just that. They were like, living should just be enough. Like living comes with like just acknowledging that like you woke up today, you're breathing, you're alive. Like celebrate that, recognize the challenges that come with that, and be okay with just living.
Yeah. Cause,
I
cause
think
it's yeah, it's a beautiful. If you get out into the world and you just spend the day outside, like you'll see so much and like do so. I'm like every day I'm out of the house, like I just like experience so many things. I'm like this is mind blowing. You know how many people I ran into in one day? Like, are you kidding me? Like it's crazy. So
I feel like your shirt saying infinity and beyond right now is like really appropriate.
yeah. No, I mean Buzz Lightyear full send. Apparently, someone told me today there's a new Buzz Lightyear movie, and I never watched it, so I felt kind of bad. I do need to watch it.
Yeah, especially wearing that shirt.
I know that's why they're like, "Damn, you're fake." I was like, "Yeah, you're right." I was like, "You're right."
We digress.
Yeah, but I wanted to say thank you for being stranger number one, sharing your story, and kind of walking me through some of the process of how I'm gonna focus the rest of these episodes. So I really appreciate you, being vulnerable and sharing. It's not easy.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for
Of course,
documenting my life
of
so I
course.
can be remembered when I'm gone.
No, actually, though, I mean for scientific purposes,
For science.
the events of every individual must truly be captured so other people cannot make the mistakes that we have made.
Play this at my funeral.
Yeah, that'd be fire. Like, think about it. Like, think about it. Like, if you really get like the truest expression of a human being, there's nothing more beautiful than that. Like, who are you really? What are your biggest fears? And like the truest expression of you, and we capture that. It's just that's oh man, that's the most beautiful thing in the world. So
So we're gonna do a part two where I get to interview you.
no, no, no. So this only works.
Come on,
This
that'd be
only
like a
works.
spe
No, no,
no, that'd be
no, no.
great. It'd
This
be like a special
no, no, no.
episode.
This works in one direction to one direction only.
We want a special
Why do you
edition
think
of
I'm
the
a podcast
podcast.
host? I'm not a podcast guest for a particular reason.
I'm gonna
this,
make it happen.
this works in
If
one
I'm still, if
direction.
this is still on the record and people are listening, for the record, I'm gonna make it happen.
But yeah, I wanted to say thank you for anyone who's made it through this far. You are
A
either
hero.
in love, you have either fallen asleep or in love with this guest, and there's lessons to be learned from everyone. But thank you so much for listening, and I will see you very soon with another episode of your anonymous portraits. Psst. Nice.